Welcome back to part 81 of our Explainer series, Decode Healthcare with Harshal. I'm seriously thrilled to have you here today. Look, did you know that healthcare facilities literally lose millions of dollars every single year to claim denials? And a massive chunk of those stem directly from Chapter 13 musculoskeletal coding errors? It's crazy, but it's true. So today, we're zeroing in on this highly specific, heavily audited area of the ICD-10-CM official guidelines, diseases of the musculoskeletal system and connective tissue. We are going to master the exact zero-fluff coding laws for pathologic versus traumatic fractures. We'll navigate those tricky osteoporosis combination codes and completely decode the Chapter 13 seventh character extensions. If you want to protect your clinical narratives from compliance audits and lock down your facility's revenue, well, you're exactly where you need to be. Let's get right into it. Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the core Chapter 13 challenge. Then distinguish pathologic from traumatic breaks, break down the osteoporosis matrix, decode those seventh character rules, and wrap up with your final coding takeaways. Section 1. The Chapter 13 Challenge, the stakes of coding. Let's dive in. So in Chapter 13, the line between a traumatic injury and an underlying disease can completely make or break a medical claim. The financial and audit stakes here are absolutely massive. Just picture this. A patient with weakened bones has a minor slip. Say, an elderly woman with severe osteoporosis simply bumps her hip against a doorway and she suffers a break. How exactly do we apply CMS rules to code that reality? I mean, would a person with healthy bones have fractured their hip from a slight bump into a doorframe? No way. If you code this as a standard trauma, you are painting a totally false clinical picture. This simple scenario is one of the most common and honestly most costly pitfalls in medical coding. The guidelines are incredibly strict here, and a single error will flag the entire claim for an auditor's review. Moving on to Section 2, Pathologic versus Traumatic Fractures, Decoding the Break. Let's get our definition straight first. A pathologic fracture, which usually falls right into category M84, is a break that happens because a disease process has fundamentally wrecked the bone tissue. Whether we're talking about a bone cyst, a nasty infection, a metastatic tumor, or osteoporosis, the bone architecture is just so weak that normal, everyday force causes a catastrophic break. Actually, scratch that. Sometimes there isn't even an external force at all. The bone just gives way on its own. The golden rule here is that the fracture is reported in addition to the underlying disease process that caused it. You have to tell the whole clinical story, linking that underlying fragility directly to the break. So the crucial dividing line is right here. A traumatic, high-impact fracture, like, from a severe car wreck or a massive fall-off of a roof onto totally healthy bone, that maps straight over to Chapter 19. But a spontaneous break or a minor slip in a patient with bone disease, that strictly maps to Chapter 13. You absolutely have to separate the traumatic force from the diseased bone breakdown. Auditors love, and I mean love, to target claims where these lines get blurred. If a chart has conflicting notes, or if there's even a shadow of a doubt about whether a fracture was pathologic or due to major trauma, the official guidelines mandate that you query the physician for the true cause before you ever drop a code. And this brings us to an absolute, non-negotiable CMS law. As a coder, you might look at a chart that just says patient fell and be incredibly tempted to slap a Chapter 19 trauma code on there. Resist that urge. A minor fall in an osteoporotic patient must be coded as pathological, not traumatic. The guidelines specifically tell us that a minor trauma that wouldn't normally break a healthy bone is, by definition, pathological. So here is your get out of audit jail free card. Never, ever assign a code for a traumatic fracture and a pathologic fracture on the exact same bone. Doing that is a fast track to a denied claim and a very, very uncomfortable conversation with your compliance officer. All right, Section 3, the osteoporosis matrix, navigating categories M80 and M81. Osteoporosis is a systemic condition, which means all the bones of the musculoskeletal system are affected. But how we actually code it? Well, that depends entirely on whether there is an active break right now. Category M80 is your designated home base for patients who have a current pathologic fracture at the exact time of the encounter. And what's really fantastic about M80 is that it uses built-in combination codes. The site of the fracture is baked right into the alphanumeric code itself, like M80.08 for a vertebra. Because of this awesome built-in specificity, you absolutely do not need a separate trauma code. Now, on the flip side, we have category M81. You assign this for uncomplicated osteoporosis when no active fracture exists. Since the disease is everywhere in the body and there's no acute break, the anatomical site just isn't a component of those M81 codes. The official guidelines are incredibly strict and explicit about this protocol. They emphasize that M80 completely replaces trauma codes for these specific patients. Think about it. If your patient has known osteoporosis and suffers a fragility fracture from a minor trip on the living room rug, M80 is your one and only path forward. Don't go looking for a trauma code. Don't try to blend the two together. The M80 category captures the exact nature of the osteoporotic break precisely as CMS requires. But hey, what if they don't have a current fracture? If your patient has osteoporosis mapped to M8 1.0, but they have a history of an osteoporotic fracture that is completely healed up, you just stack the M81 code with the Z87.310 history code. Now you might be wondering, why go through the trouble? Well, because a patient who has broken a bone from osteoporosis once is at a massively higher risk to do it again. This combination coding accurately captures their high-risk ongoing disease profile while strictly respecting the fact that the acute phase of their previous fracture is totally over. It gives the pair the full historical context without inflating current resource use. Let's move into Section 4, 7th Character Extension Rules, Tracking the Healing Journey. For Chapter 13 Fractures, the 7th character is mandatory. Think of it as your ultimate decoder ring that tells the pair exactly where the patient is in their healing journey. The letter A designates active, initial treatment. This is the acute phase. Once that active treatment is wrapped up, D takes over for routine subsequent care. Things like a follow-up X-ray or getting a cast removed. And if things go south during that recovery process, characters like K or P step in to denote severe complications in that healing timeline. There's a really critical nuance here that catches a lot of people off guard. The A character for the initial encounter is assigned as long as the patient is receiving active treatment for the condition. Listen closely to this part. This applies even if a brand new provider is stepping in for the very first time to help. For example, if the ER doc evaluates the break and puts a splint on, that is an A. When the patient goes to the orthopedic surgeon the very next day for a surgical repair, that encounter is still coded with an A. It's not about whether it's the provider's first time seeing the patient. It is entirely about whether the patient is still actively being treated for the acute phase of that fracture. Now, when routine healing fails, we have to move past D. These specific 7th characters trigger specialized audit scrutiny, so you need to know exactly what they mean. G stands for delayed healing, which is, well, exactly what it sounds like. K is for non-union, meaning the bone simply isn't knitting back together at all. P is for malunion, where the bone did heal, but in the wrong position or alignment. And S is for a sequela, or the late effect of the injury. These characters are vital because they explain to the payer exactly why a patient is still eating up expensive healthcare resources long after a fracture should have routinely resolved. And I really want to hammer this point home because it is a massive, incredibly common pitfall for coders. Do not use aftercare Z codes, like Z47 for orthopedic aftercare, for traumatic or pathologic fractures. Just don't do it. Always let that 7th character, which is usually D, do all the heavy lifting for subsequent care. If you put a generalized Z code on a specific fracture follow-up, your claim is going to get snagged, rejected, and sent right back to your desk. The 7th character is literally all the aftercare documentation CMS wants to see. Okay, bringing it home. Section 5, Final Coding Takeaways, Securing CMS Compliance. Here is your ultimate summary of the Chapter 13 laws. Rule number 1, know exactly when to separate pathology from trauma. A minor force on an osteoporotic bone is always Chapter 13. 2, master the M80 matrix, remembering that M80 includes the active fracture automatically without needing a secondary trauma code. 3, use M81 for uncomplicated osteoporosis and stack it with a Z code for a history of healed fractures to show clinical risk. And 4, rigorously apply those 7th characters to accurately track whether the patient is receiving active, routine, or complicated care. I'll leave you with this final thought to ponder today. Mastering these subtle, strict matrices isn't just about plugging in alphanumeric characters. As medical coding guidelines continue to evolve, your mastery of these rules accurately tells the patient's true medical story to safeguard against audit risks, ensure proper reimbursement, and maintain pristine data tracking. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer on the Chapter 13 guidelines. Be sure to like, subscribe, and tune in next time for Part 82, where we are going to tackle Chapter 14, Diseases of the Genitourinary System. We'll be breaking down chronic kidney disease staging, ESRD, and kidney transplant status rules. It's going to be a good one. See you then.